Welcome to the MSU Deer Labs online seminar series brought to you by the Mississippi State University Extension Service and the Forest and Wildlife Research Center. My name is Bronson Strickland. I will be your presenter today, and I'm the St. John Family Professor of Wildlife Management and co-director of the MSU Deer Lab. Now let's talk about a form of selective harvest that is effective, and that is selection to improve the standing crop of bucks, or another way to say it is to make room for better bucks. And when I say standing crop, because I'll be using it time and time again, what I mean by that is the existing population of bucks on your property. So the standing crop of bucks that are alive on your property. No implications for genetics, no implication for offspring. All we're talking about is manipulating the harvest of the existing population of bucks on your property. So how do we manage the standing crop of bucks on your property? It starts with age. It cannot be based totally on antlers, but rather it is age combined with, as you'll see later, combined with antler size or antler characteristics to make a harvest decision. But it is not solely based on antler characteristics. That is one of the biggest problems that we see with antler restrictions or antler regulations, they're sometimes called, or selective harvest criteria for antlers, etc., etc. A lot of different names for it. But basically drawing your line in the sand and saying an antler dimension of this means he can be harvested and the antler dimension of this means he can't be. You're going to run into problems. Here's a very simple example, but one that is very, very common. And that is something like an 8-point rule, or a 6-point rule, or a 4 points on one side rule, etc., etc. When you just use a criterion like that, you're going to make mistakes. You're going to get it right sometimes, no doubt about it. You're going to get it wrong sometimes, no doubt about it. Very simple example you see here. Mature buck on the left-hand side here, the left-hand photo, that is an 8-pointer. And yeah, absolutely, that is a buck eligible for harvest. It is a good buck to harvest. Take a look at the right. If you have an 8-point rule, there you have that probably a 2-year-old buck with 8 points that has a lot of upside, has a lot of potential, and you're going to harvest it simply because it had 8 points. And so that's what I want to emphasize here. You can't just use the antler dimensions without coupling it with the age to make a good harvest decision. Okay, now here's the flip side. Let's say you still have that same 8-point rule or 7-point rule or 6-point, whatever. Here's a buck on the left. He's young, looks like he's a 5-pointer, and he's going to be protected. In that case, it worked. That's a good thing. That was a buck with smaller antlers. It's a younger buck. You protected him with that type of antler regulation. How about the buck on the right? Clearly a mature buck. Looks like he has 5 points or so, and he is going to be protected. Now, is that what you want? Is the buck on the right, because his antler dimensions are less than some arbitrary dimension, do you want to protect that individual buck, thinking about all the food that he's going to eat throughout the year, which is about a ton? In his case, it may be more than a ton of food, but he is protected from harvest. Is that really what you want? Now, think about it even more. What if you have a lot of bucks on your property that have that type of antler size, that are that old, and they are perpetually protected from harvest? What's going to happen to your range quality in terms of food over time when you do that? So again, you've seen two different scenarios here of what can happen. One of those is that you're going to use an antler restriction to harvest a buck that shouldn't have been. He was too young. And in this case, you're using the same antler restriction. Now we're going to protect a buck that should have been harvested, and now it's going to be protected. Okay, let's review some basic statistics here. So this might be a point where you want to pause and either go get a cup of coffee or a snack or a drink of water or something like that. Unfortunately, we're going to have to go back and do some really basic math, but I promise it will not be that difficult. Hopefully it'll make sense, and it has huge implications for deer management. Understanding this very basic statistical concept as it applies to deer management. I'm using an example here of men's height in the US. And what you see here in this distribution is what is called the bell-shaped curve, or it's also called the normal distribution. So it's a very common distribution that we see. And the way to interpret this is on this axis here, the y-axis, this would be percent of the population. It could also be percent of the sample. You know, the number of animals or objects, whatever you measured, this is the percentage of them. And here on the x-axis here, we have height. So this is the height of men in the US. The units are inches here. And what we see is that the height of the curve here, this would be the average or the mean, which is 5 foot 10 inches or 70 inches. So this is the most common observation. This is the most common height because this is the frequency. The frequency here in the population is greatest for this particular height. And notice as we move to the right, in other words, in this case, as we get taller and taller, the frequency of those heights gets less and less. As we move to the left, similarly, the frequency of those heights gets less and less. So we see over here that a man 6'8", that is less than 1% of the population. A man over here that's 4'8", again, is less than 1% of the population. And if we add these two bars here, and we calculate the area under the curve here, we notice that 80% of the men's population, 80% of the time, they are going to have a height between 65 inches and 75 inches. So that is normal. That's, you know, really normal height of American men. Now, when we get over 75 inches in height, that becomes rare. So that becomes rare in the population. These are the really tall men in the United States. Similarly, over here, less than 65 inches is also 10% of the population. So this kind of shows you the distribution, giving an example of men's height. So let's now apply this to deer management and apply it to bucks. Okay, the antler size of mature bucks, and what I'm using here, this is data for Mississippi. In your neck of the woods, it might be a little different. I'll show you some examples of that. But in Mississippi, if we looked at the statewide average, it follows a bell-shaped curve, a normal distribution, just like the height of men in the US. The average statewide in Mississippi is about 126 inches. That would be bucks that are 5.5 years of age or older. And we see that bucks, you know, again, those that we would call trophy status, they're going to be way over here. They are very infrequent in the population. You don't see very many of them. Same thing, that these bucks over here, even though they are fully mature, some bucks are just going to have the genetic code to have really small antlers. But they are infrequent in the population. So again, on the average, we're looking at most of the deer. Again, probably our 80 or so percent are going to fall right into this category here, going to score around 125 inches, give or take. Now, I said a moment ago, depending on where you're at, the curve will be, it's not going to be shaped different, but it's going to have different values. And so I had a slide at the beginning of the presentation showing you the average antler size across the different soil regions or physiographic regions of Mississippi. And now we see kind of how that plays out. If you're in the Delta region, again, really good soil, lots of agriculture, the average antler size there is going to be about 136 inches. When we compare that or contrast that with the lower coastal plain in the southern part of the state, we see that their average there is about 117. The same type of distribution, though, occurs, meaning that if the average is 117, there are still going to be bucks in that lower coastal plain region that have antlers larger than 117 inches. But as you move further and further to the right, their frequency starts getting less and less. Same thing in the Delta region. The average is a lot bigger, but to get those really big bucks, those 170, even 180 or more, they are very, very infrequent in the population. So this bell-shaped curve, it doesn't matter if you're in Mississippi, if you're in Florida, or if you're in Maine, the same relationship exists. What moves from region to region is this average here. This is going to move around based on typically the abundance of food on the landscape. Okay, I want to review the same concept. I'm just going to display it graphically a little bit different. Instead of having these really pretty smooth curves, I've formatted the data in a bar chart. And so every one of these categories is 10 inches of Boone and Crockett score. And so again, over here on the left, these bucks have smaller antlers, but there are fewer of them on the landscape. Here, this is going to be your average, right in the middle. These are the most frequent antler sizes, and these are the really big guys, and they are, again, not as frequent. We see them less and less. This is for 3.5-year-old bucks. And now we're now gonna move and look at how this distribution changes by age class within a region. So this is the 4.5-year-old age class here. Notice that it doesn't look much different at all. The only thing that happened is that we moved the average to the right. So now we shifted the average. A moment ago with 3.5, it was around 100 or so, and now we've moved it over to 110 and some in the 120s. So we have the exact same shaped curve. We've just moved the average over to the right. And finally, we have here the fully mature bucks, 5.5 years of age or greater. And again, the same thing. We went from 3.5 to 4.5 and 5.5 at each time. We still have the same general bell-shaped curve. We've just moved the average further to the right. We've got a lot of bucks now, even though they're 5.5. They have smaller antlers, much below average antler size, and then very few over here. And so again, just start looking at this. What proportion of the population of mature bucks have 150 inches of antler? It is less than 5%. Less than 5%. So if you're sitting in a deer stand and you were lucky enough to have 100 mature bucks walk past you, only about 4 of them are going to have 150-inch antlers. So again, this is a very, very rare animal in your buck population. Even more rare to have 160 inches or 170 inches or more than that.